Immigration has always been a contentious and complex topic in the United States, especially the issue of undocumented or illegal immigrants. According to estimates, there are roughly 10 to 12 million undocumented immigrants living in the U.S., many of whom contribute to the economy, raise families, and participate in communities. But what if the United States government decided to deport every single illegal immigrant? What if overnight millions of people were forcibly removed from their homes, workplaces, and neighborhoods? What would the consequences be for the economy, society, politics, and the very fabric of American life? To fully understand the implications of such a drastic policy, we must first recognize the scale of undocumented immigration and the role these individuals play in the American system. Undocumented immigrants work in a variety of sectors, including agriculture, construction, hospitality, food service, manufacturing, and domestic work. They fill jobs that are often labor-intensive, low-paying, and undesirable to many native-born workers. Many have lived in the U.S. for years or decades, raising children who are U.S. citizens. Deporting this population would not just remove workers, it would uproot families, destabilize communities, and disrupt economic chains that are often invisible to the general public. The immediate economic impact of mass deportation would be severe. Agriculture is one of the sectors most reliant on undocumented workers. Farms across the country, especially in states like California, Florida, and Texas, depend on migrant laborers to plant, tend, and harvest crops. Without these workers, agricultural production would plummet. Crops could rot unharvested, leading to shortages and soaring food prices nationwide. This would particularly affect fresh produce, which is more labor-intensive to harvest and less mechanized. The food supply chain would face bottlenecks, and consumers, especially those with lower incomes, would feel the pinch in grocery stores. Beyond agriculture, industries such as construction would face massive labor shortages. Projects might halt, deadlines would be missed, and costs would skyrocket due to the scarcity of workers. The hospitality sector, including hotels and restaurants, would be similarly impacted. Many restaurants rely on undocumented immigrants for kitchen and cleaning staff. Without them, services would be cut, menus shortened, and prices increased. The U.S. economy would experience a contraction in output and consumer spending, driven in part by reduced labor supply and increased prices. Mass deportation would also deeply affect the social fabric. Millions of families would be torn apart. According to the Pew Research Center, many undocumented immigrants have children who are American citizens. Deporting parents would leave children behind, creating widespread emotional trauma and potential increases in foster care placements. Communities with large immigrant populations would see demographic upheaval. Schools, places of worship, and neighborhoods would experience sudden, drastic changes. The psychological toll on both deported individuals and those left behind would be profound. Politically, the decision to deport all illegal immigrants would be explosive. The policy would likely trigger fierce opposition from immigrant rights groups, civil rights organizations, religious institutions, and many local governments. It could also fuel xenophobia and social unrest in some areas. The nation might become deeply polarized, with tensions rising between advocates for immigration enforcement and those defending immigrant communities. Internationally, the U.S. could face diplomatic backlash from countries whose citizens are being deported, complicating foreign relations. Healthcare would be another sector affected. Undocumented immigrants contribute to healthcare systems as patients and workers. Many are employed as home health aides, nursing assistants, and in other caregiving roles. Removing them from the workforce would increase the burden on already stretched healthcare providers. In addition, emergency rooms and public health programs would see new challenges, including managing the health of displaced individuals during and after deportation efforts. The criminal justice system would be overwhelmed by the logistics of detaining, processing, and deporting millions. The cost to taxpayers would be astronomical, requiring massive expansion of detention centers, law enforcement personnel, and legal resources. Moreover, the process would raise serious ethical and human rights questions, especially regarding the treatment of vulnerable populations such as children, the elderly, and victims of violence. Education would also suffer. Many children of undocumented immigrants attend public schools and contribute to the cultural diversity and vibrancy of classrooms. mass deportation would lead to declining enrollment in certain districts, affecting school funding, teacher jobs, and educational programs. The loss of these students would impact schools economically and socially, reducing multicultural exposure and opportunity for cross-cultural learning. On the labor front, the deportation of millions would also affect native-born workers and the broader economy. While some argue that removing undocumented immigrants would free up jobs for American citizens, the reality is more nuanced. Many jobs held by undocumented workers are not easily replaced by native-born workers due to skill, willingness, or wage expectations. Shortages could push wages up in some sectors, which might sound positive for workers, but could also lead to higher prices, lower productivity, and reduced competitiveness for U.S. businesses. In the long term, the U.S. economy could face structural damage. Immigrants, including undocumented ones, are responsible for a disproportionate share of entrepreneurship. They start businesses that create jobs and innovation. Removing these entrepreneurial forces would slow business formation and economic dynamism. Tax revenues from immigrant workers and consumers would also decline, putting pressure on government budgets, especially for programs funded through payroll taxes. Socially, deportation would deepen inequality and hardship for millions. Those forced to leave the U.S. would often return to countries with fewer economic opportunities and less stable social systems. Families torn apart would struggle with poverty, education loss, and trauma. Communities in the U.S. would lose not just workers, but neighbors, friends, and cultural contributors. The fabric of many cities and towns would be fundamentally altered. The political landscape would also shift. Areas with large immigrant populations often vote differently than those without. Removing these communities from the electorate could change local and national politics. Policies around education, healthcare, policing, and welfare might become more conservative or less inclusive. The national dialogue around race, identity, and belonging could become even more fraught. Internationally, the U.S. might find itself isolated or criticized for harsh immigration policies. Allies could question America's commitment to human rights and humanitarian values. Trade negotiations might be impacted by diplomatic tensions. Meanwhile, deported individuals might struggle to reintegrate into their countries of origin, some of which have weak institutions or ongoing conflicts. Ethically, mass deportation raises profound questions about justice, fairness, and human dignity. How should a society balance the rule of law with compassion for people who have contributed to the country? What obligations do nations have toward migrants who have built lives and families over years? These questions are difficult and divisive, but unavoidable in any serious discussion about immigration policy. Enforcement logistics alone present massive challenges. Deporting millions would require unprecedented coordination between federal agencies, local law enforcement, courts, and immigration officials. Mistakes and abuses could occur, including wrongful deportations and violations of due process. The emotional and social cost would ripple through families and communities for decades. In response to such a policy, there could be unintended consequences, including a rise in underground economies and exploitation of undocumented workers who remain hidden. Crime rates might increase in some areas as desperate individuals struggle to survive. Public trust in government institutions could erode if the policy is seen as heavy-handed or unjust. In conclusion, while deporting all illegal immigrants might appeal to some as a way to enforce laws strictly, the reality is far more complicated. The economic, social, political, and ethical consequences would be enormous and lasting. Millions of lives would be disrupted, economies would suffer, communities would fracture, and America's global standing could be damaged. Immigration, both legal and undocumented, is woven into the country's identity and economic vitality. Removing such a large population forcibly would not be a simple solution, but a profound upheaval with costs that could last generations.